John Wayne Glover is one of Australia's most notorious serial murderers. He terrorized Sydney, Australia from 1989 to 1990, through brutal attacks on elderly women in wealthy suburbs. John was a loving husband and father. His family had no inclinations that he was the man the entire nation wanted caught. Yet some say it is because of his mother-in-law and his own mother that he preyed on elderly women. He is originally from a working-class family in Wolverhampton, England. He was convicted of many petty crimes dating back to 1947 for stealing clothing and handbags. He was later thrown out of the British Army when these were discovered. Later, he emigrated to Australia in 1956, where he first lived in Melbourne. He had a troubled relationship with older women in his life, especially his mother Frida, who had had several husbands and many boyfriends, and after 1968 his mother-in-law, when he married and moved into his parent-in-law's house in Mosman, Sydney. Before John began his killings in the late 1980s, he was a volunteer at the Senior Citizens Society, and was considered among his friends a friendly, trustworthy man. He was married with 2 children, and lived a contented lifestyle in Mosman. He worked as a sales representative for 4n20 pies. Shortly after immigrating from England to Australia, John was convicted on 2 counts of larceny in Victoria, and a stealing charge in New South Wales. In 1962, he was convicted on 2 counts of assaulting women in Melbourne, 2 counts of indecent assault, 1 of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and another 4 counts of larceny. For this he received a 3-year good behavior bond. These attacks were reported to be extremely severe, and on each occasion certain articles of clothing had been removed. The victims were forced to the ground while he violently tore their clothing. A 25-year-old woman was on her way home from a meeting at about 10:30 p.m. when she was followed and chased down a dark suburban street. The attacker knocked her to the ground unconscious. Later she awoke in a garden bleeding profusely and her undergarments in a state of disarray. The attacker made a run for it when her screams alerted residents. At the time of these offenses, John was employed as a television rigger for the ABC and lived in the Melbourne suburb of Camberwell. There is no proof of him killing before 1989, when he was 56. At this stage, he had been married for 20 years and had children, and his wife had no knowledge of his previous offenses. On January 11, 1989, 84-year-old Margaret Todhunter was walking down Hale Road, Mosman, where she was seen by John. After parking his car, he walked to the victim. He punched Margaret in the face, and stole the contents of her purse including $209. He then went to the Mosman RSL club where he spent Margaret's money. Investigating police concluded the crime was a mugging and held little hope of finding the perpetrator. On March 1, 1989, as he left the Mosman RSL in Military Road, John saw 82-year-old Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill walking down the street. He returned to his car and put a hammer under his belt. He followed Gwendolyn to the entry foyer of her Military Road apartment building. As she went to open the front door, he hit her with the hammer on the back of her head. He then continued to strike her about the head and body. Several of her ribs were broken. John fled the scene taking her purse containing $100. She was still alive when she found by 2 schoolboys. The elderly woman was quickly rushed to the emergency ward by ambulance. One of the medics suddenly had a thought about the woman's bag, how it had been looked through but was placed neatly with her other items. His suspicions nagged at him, so he reported the incident to Mosman police. Meanwhile, doctors worked quickly to prevent further blood building up in her brain. Yet on further examination they began to come to the conclusion that she had not simply fallen. Her wounds were not consistent with a fall. As well as her head injuries, she had 2 black eyes and several broken ribs. One of the doctors also decided to contact Mosman police. She lost her battle for life later that same evening. Mosman police sent the physical evidence crew and homicide detectives to investigate what was possibly a murder. A check of the woman's handbag found that it did not contain her purse, which she had with her earlier that day. The homicide squad from Chatswood joined the team from Mosman. Someone had attacked and murdered a defenseless old woman, and police wanted to find out quickly who it was. The police had no eyewitnesses or leads, and there was nothing concrete to link this attack with the previous attack on Margaret Todhunter. There was no forensic evidence either, as good-intentioned neighbors, believing she had merely fallen, had washed the crime scene. The police assumed that it was another mugging gone wrong. On May 9, 1989, John was walking along Military Road when he saw 84-year-old Lady Ashton, the widow of the artist Sir William Ashton, walking towards him. She was on her way home to nearby Raglan Street. He put on a pair of gloves and followed her into the foyer of her apartment, where he attacked her with his hammer. He then threw her to the ground and dragged her into a rubbish bin alcove where he repeatedly hit her head on the pavement. John recalled that she had almost overpowered him, until he fell on top of her and started to hit her head on the pavement. After she was knocked unconscious, he removed her pantyhose and strangled her. He placed Lady Ashton's walking stick and shoes at her feet. He then left with her purse containing $100. John headed for the Mossman RSL, where he commented to staff that he hoped the sirens outside weren't for another mugging. The police found Lady Ashton lying face down diagonally across the concrete floor of the small bin alcove. There was a pool of blood around her head. The pantyhose were strung so tight around her neck that it cut through the skin. Her bare legs were crossed and her arms were placed by her sides. She had a thin trickle of blood running out of her mouth. At this point, the police concluded they were facing a serial killer. To date, all 3 victims were wealthy elderly women from the same suburb, and were all assaulted or killed in the same manner before being robbed of their handbags. A postmortem was carried out and no sign of semen was found. The ligature mark around her neck measured 9 centimeters. She had bruises on her nose and temple, on her neck, and both her eyelids. At some stage during the struggle she bit her lips, causing damage to the inner lining of her mouth. There was a wound on her cheek, which was an open cut that had a small, semicircular abrasion which was a few centimeters away from it. The examiner noted the victim's diamond ring was still present, suggesting that she had not been killed for money. Police consultant Dr. Rod Milton, a psychiatrist, was asked to assist police in constructing a profile of the offender they sought. The information was not released to the public. On June 6, 1989, John molested 77-year-old Marjorie Mosley at the Wesley Gardens retirement home in Belrose. The victim reported to hospital staff and police that a man had put his hand under her nightgown, but that she could not remember what the man looked like. On June 24, 1989, he visited the Caroline Chisholm nursing home in Lane Cove, where he lifted the dress of an elderly patient and fondled her buttocks. In a neighboring room, he slid his hand down the front of another patient's nightdress and stroked her breasts. The woman cried out for help and John was briefly questioned by staff at the hospital before leaving. On August 8, 1989, he assaulted the elderly Effie Carney in a back street of Lindfield, on Sydney's Upper North Shore. On October 6, he pretended to be a doctor and ran his hand up the dress of Phyllis McNeil, a patient at the Wybenia nursing home in the Lower North Shore suburb of Neutral Bay. He left when the Phyllis called for help. At the time, he was apparently never suspected of, or identified as being responsible for the molestations. On October 18, 1989, he followed 86-year-old widow Doris Cox along Spit Road, Mossman, to her retirement village. In the secluded stairwell at the front of the house he attacked her, ramming her face into a brick wall where she fell. Amazingly, she survived the assault, but she was not able to provide a clear description or recollection of events, probably due to her dementia. According to her, the attacker was a young man, possibly a teenager or skateboarder. She provided police with an identikit drawing, but again the scene was washed down by neighbors before investigators arrived. On November 2, 1989, John approached 78-year-old Lane Cove resident Dorothy Banky while she was walking home in a quiet back street, just off Longueville Road, Lane Cove, about 10 kilometers from Mossman. He then engaged her in conversation and offered to carry her groceries home for her. Dorothy invited him inside her house for a cup of tea. He declined the tea, but on the return down the laneway to the main street, he passed another old woman and then assaulted her from behind. The victim this time was 85-year-old widow Margaret Pahud, also on her way home from grocery shopping, and the police were certain this was the work of the Granny killer. She was hit on the back of the head with a blunt instrument, and when she collapsed he struck her again on the side of the head. John rearranged her clothing, shoes, and walking stick, took her handbag and left. Again, nobody saw the attack. But within a few minutes her body was found by a young schoolgirl who at first thought the body was a pile of clothing dumped in the laneway. Neighbors yet again washed down the crime scene. As the police and ambulance were on their way, John rummaged through the contents of Margaret's purse on the grounds of a nearby golf club. He then headed off to the Mossman RSL Club to again spend $300 he had stolen. Within 24 hours of the Margaret's murder, on November 3, 81-year-old Olive Cleveland became the fourth woman killed by the now so-called granny killer. He struck up a conversation with Olive while she was sitting on a bench just outside the Wesley Gardens retirement village, where she lived in the suburb of Belrose. When Olive became uncomfortable, she got up and proceeded to walk to the main building. John seized her from behind and forced her down a ramp into a secluded side lane. Here he hit her and repeatedly pushed her head into the concrete before he removed her pantyhose and tied them tightly around her neck. Once again he rearranged her clothing, shoes, and walking stick, then left taking $60 from her handbag. Once again, the old woman's injuries were initially attributed to a heavy fall and the crime scene was yet again washed down. There were no eyewitnesses. Shortly afterwards the state government doubled the reward to $200,000. On November 23, 1989, John was sitting in the Buena Vista Hotel in Middlehead Road, Mossman, when he saw 93-year-old widow Muriel Falconer walking opposite the hotel. He returned to his car, parked opposite the police station, to retrieve his hammer and gloves. He followed Muriel to the exterior of her home in Muston Street. He quietly moved up behind her while the partially deaf and blind Muriel opened her front door. He put his hand around her mouth to silence her, before repeatedly hitting her around the head and neck with his hammer. When she fell to the floor, John began to remove Muriel's pantyhose. As he did this, she began to regain consciousness and cried for help. This prompted him to hit her multiple times with the hammer until she finally passed out. He removed her undergarments and used them to strangle her. He searched her purse and the rest of her house for valuables before leaving with $100, again after rearranging her shoes. The following afternoon, the body was discovered by a neighbor who entered using a spare key. Fortunately for investigators, the crime scene this time was intact, and forensic evidence, such as a bloody shoe prints, was collected. Police were now starting to home in on a suspect identified by the neighbor as both middle-aged, portly, and gray-haired. The reward is increased to $250,000 by Christmas. On January 11, 1990, John visited the Greenwich Hospital in River Road, Greenwich, on his pie sales round. He was in his work uniform and carried a clipboard, and entered the hospital's palliative care ward where there were 4 elderly and ill women, including 82-year-old advanced cancer patient Daisy Roberts. He asked if she was losing any body heat. He then pulled up her nightgown and touched her in an indecent manner. Daisy panicked and called for help, upon which a hospital sister found John in the ward. When confronted, he ran from the ward and the sister was able to record his car's registration number and notified police. The hospital staff were able to identify and name John, as he was known from doing his pie rounds. A week later, the police returned with a photograph of him which Sister Davis and Mrs. Roberts positively identified. Although this was a significant breakthrough, the hospital assaults were not linked to the murders, nor reported to the murder task force for 3 weeks. Detectives from Chatswood Police Station contacted and confirmed John's name via his employers. Detectives contacted him and requested he attend an interview at the station the following day. When he failed to appear, the police rang his home and were informed by his wife that he had attempted suicide by overdose, and was recovering at the Royal North Shore Hospital. Police went to the hospital to see him, but he declined to be interviewed, although he did permit them to take a photograph. Staff at the hospital handed police a note that was written by John, in the middle of the page on 4N20 Pies business paper, that contained the words, "No more grannies." Grannies and Essie, Glover's mother-in-law, started it. It was 2 weeks before the suicide note and photo were passed on to the task force, now numbering some 70 members, whereupon detectives believed immediately that John was the killer, although they had no evidence. The head of the detective task force said, "If he had said to us, 'I don't want to talk,' we couldn't have proved a thing. Still, the photo matched the descriptions of the gray-haired suspect, and in his job as a pie salesman, he could have been at any of the murder scenes. John was interviewed over the nursing home assaults and denied all accusations. Police had limited evidence and decided not to question him over the murders, which would have let him know of the police suspicions. John was put under constant police surveillance, including, at one stage, with an automatic tracking device. To make sure that he wasn't being followed, he would drive around the block more than once, or drive the wrong way up one-way streets. On March 19, 1990, John killed his sixth and final victim, 60-year-old divorcee Joan Sinclair, with whom he had a platonic relationship, in Beauty Point, Mossman. By this stage, police had him under constant surveillance and watched as Joan let John into her home at approximately 10 a.m. By 1 p.m. there was no sign of John or movement within the house. Police and the surveillance team became concerned at about 5 p.m. and got permission to enter the house at 6 p.m. 2 uniformed police knocked on the front door, ostensibly to check on barking dogs, to no answer, and saw through rear glass door a hammer lying in a pool of dry blood on a mat. 4 detectives searched the house and found Joan's battered head wrapped in a bundle of blood-soaked towels. She was naked from the waist down and her pantyhose were tied around her neck. Her genitals were damaged, but John would later deny raping her. After finding her body, they then searched the house for John, who was found unconscious in the filled bathtub. He later told police he murdered Joan and explained they had been having a relationship for some time. He said that he beat her about the head with his hammer, removed her pantyhose, and strangled her with them. He rolled the body onto a mat, wrapped 4 towels around her extensive head wounds to stem the flow of blood, then dragged her body across the room, leaving a trail of blood. He then ran the bath, swallowed a handful of Valium with a bottle of VAT 69, slashed his left wrist and lay in the tub to die. The police were relieved he had survived, as otherwise they feared ongoing speculation as to whether John was the murderer. He admitted to the killings when confronted with the police evidence. He denied responsibility for other crimes in which he was a prime suspect, including the bashing murder of Florence Broadhurst in her Paddington home in 1977. A number of years after his conviction, he admitted that he never worried about who his victims were, or why he killed them. He said he wanted to stop killing, but couldn't. After each murder he apparently went about his normal life. At the trial, commencing March 28, 1990, John Wayne Glover pleaded not guilty to his crimes on the grounds of diminished responsibility. A psychiatrist said John had built up hostility and aggression since his childhood against his mother and then against his mother-in-law, who was said to have triggered him. When she died, he had to take out his aggression on someone else. The psychiatrist who studied the case also added that this was a very unusual case because there are very few mass murders, and most of the perpetrators are mentally ill and have an organic disease of the brain. According to this psychiatrist, John was sane at the time of the murders. The Crown prosecutor maintained that he was well aware of his actions. When he killed, he was also planning what to do with the victim's money, and also took time to clean the hammer with acid. John was impotent and had no interest in sex, so tying the pantyhose so tightly around his victim's neck was to make sure they were dead, at the same time trying to trick the police into thinking that this was the work of a sexually motivated killer. He was addicted to poker machines, and the easiest way for him to get more money was to steal. After the guilty verdict was delivered, the presiding judge stated that he was dealing with an extremely dangerous prisoner. He is able to choose when to attack and when to stay his hand. He is cunning and able to cover his tracks. It is plain that he has chosen his moments carefully. Although the crimes have been opportunistic, he has not gone in where the risks were overwhelming. The period since January 1989 has been one of intense and serious crime involving extreme violence, inflicted on elderly women, accompanied by theft or robbery of their property. On any view, the prisoner has shown himself to be an exceedingly dangerous person, and that view was mirrored by the opinions of the psychiatrists who gave evidence at his trial. I have no alternative other than to impose the maximum available sentence, which means that the prisoner will be required to spend the remainder of his natural life in jail. It is inappropriate to express any date as to release on parole. Having regard to those life sentences, this is not a case where the prisoner may ever be released pursuant to order of this court. He is never to be released. John Wayne Glover was convicted of the 6 murders and received 6 life sentences. He died by suicide at age 72 in his Lithgow jail cell in 2005. Days before John finally committed suicide, on his 3rd known attempt, he handed his last outside visitor a sketch. The sketch was of a park with significant changes in the sketch, pointed out by John was 2 palm trees. In the middle of the right palm tree, the number 9 can be seen between leaves and branches. The number 9 is said to represent the number of murders that he committed, or the number of unsolved murders still out there that he committed. Okay, guys, this was the end of this story. If you enjoy, I will appreciate if you subscribe.